Okay, hello, Abhijit. I have just discovered that you are doing an American history series. I have been a follower of your channel for quite a long time, and I've really enjoyed a lot of the stuff that you did. And so I'm glad that you're doing this. And I think it's really interesting to think that you're going to read 100 books. I do agree with you. It's probably not a good idea to start with somebody like Howard Zinn or the equally biased book that you held up on the other side of that. So I'm on the same page with you about that. A little bit about me. I teach history at the college level, world history as well as U.S. history. And so I've been very interested in what you're doing because I'm also in kind of a career transition and I'm beginning to point my history content more at the outside world. And so in the first place, I want to say I really think you did a great job summarizing and giving a synopsis of a lot of material from about the year 1000 to the voyages of Columbus. But along the way, there are a couple of things that I want to point out as well. And one of these things is the translation of Vinland, which I believe is better understood as the land of meadows rather than as the land of vines. There is a story about the grapes and the vines and all of that. But honestly, I'm not entirely convinced that that wasn't sort of a retrospective thing that was put in after the fact to try to explain what the word Vinland meant. But another thing that I think is a little more important that I want to point out is that one of the big reasons that the Norse went there and then that a bunch of other Europeans, including the Basques and the Portuguese and possibly even the English out of Bristol, were already going back there to fish for cod on the Grand Banks, which are just on the continental shelf adjacent to Newfoundland. And that may be an explanation of why Columbus believed that by traveling a month westward, he would get someplace because other people already had. And of course, he was married to a Portuguese noblewoman and he traveled a lot in Portuguese elite circles. And so he would have been in a position to have heard these stories. And then moving on to the case of Vespucci, there does seem to be some consensus that the 1497 trip that he talked about may have been an exaggeration or may have been completely made up. But the thing that Vespucci did was he went back to Europe after the 1499 trip and he wrote a book called Mundus Novus, New World in Latin. And that actually made the point that the land that had been discovered was not India, or it wasn't islands near Japan or anything like that, which you're right, Columbus kind of insisted almost all the way to his grave that that was the case. But Vespucci said, no, this is something new. And that is one of the reasons why Martin Waldseemüller named the continent America. Moving on, you do mention in an aside, kind of jumping forward in time, that the Spaniards lose Hispaniola in 1795 to Napoleon. Actually, what happens in 1791 is the Haitian Revolution, the only time in world history, I believe, when a group of enslaved people not only got their freedom, but established a nation for themselves. And that ultimately would be the nation of Haiti. So the Haitian Revolution is going on from 1791 onwards. And yes, in Europe, Napoleon is conquering Spain and putting his brother Joseph Bonaparte on the throne and doing a lot of things. And so there are arguments about who owns a spot on the map, but that's not necessarily what's actually going on in Hispaniola. And then you go on to talk a little bit about Bartolomé de las Casas and the encomienda. And I thought it was really interesting that you compared it to a labor system that the British Raj imposed on India that did sound very much like feudalism. There was an element, you talk a little bit later on when you're talking about Las Casas about conversion. And I think that that's a point that you could have expanded on, because the idea of the encomienda, and it begins during the Spanish reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslims that they called the Moors, who had taken it over in the 700s. And then the Spaniards spent the next 700 years trying to take it back in the Reconquista. One of the things that they did during that period, and that they learned to do, and that they then transferred over to the Americas, was the encomienda, where you would grant a piece of land and the souls living on it to generally someone who had helped win the battle, right? And they had a whole culture around becoming ennobled by way of war. But the point was that the encomendero, the person getting the grant, was responsible for making sure that the people who lived on that land, who of course for 700 years had been Muslims, converted to Christianity and stayed converted. Now, that was an element of the encomienda in Spain that was kind of honored in the breach in the New World. But it was one of the reasons that Las Casas became involved. And you're right, he did call for bringing enslaved Africans over, which was something that the Spanish and the Portuguese had been doing on the islands off the African coast, where they had been growing sugar that the West had kind of discovered in Palestine during the First Crusade. The final point that I want to call to your attention is the depopulation of Hispaniola and Cuba, Puerto Rico, all of the Caribbean islands, which would then extend into Central America, South America, and ultimately also North America. And historians call that the Columbian Exchange, or at least they do since the 1970s when Alfred Crosby published a book called The Columbian Exchange, in which he, for the first time, really sustained the point that it wasn't so much guns or steel or horses or attack dogs or Spanish cruelty or anything like that. It was disease that made the difference. And so, of course, that was something that Las Casas didn't really know about because Europe didn't have a germ theory of disease in the early 1500s. And so he attributed all of the depopulation to either Spanish cruelty or to the depression and despair of the natives. And he said that, for instance, native mothers would practice infanticide and that sort of thing to prevent their children from having to live in this hell that the Spaniards had created. And certainly there was a lot of cruelty, and there probably was some infanticide. But the thing that is left out of that story is the disease that came and wiped out probably 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas, which created an opportunity for first the Spanish and the Portuguese, and then the Dutch and the French and the English to come in and take away that land and take advantage of that social and political chaos that had been created by this disease. So again, I really enjoyed this. I am looking forward to continuing to watch this, and maybe I will continue to comment, and maybe we could even collaborate at some point, because I think that what you're doing is a really good thing, and I think that I agree with you about why this is important. So, congratulations. Looking forward to seeing more. Ciao.